Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to It Says What, where JW3 and Limmud come together to bring you unexpected and exciting Jewish content from across the Jewish community every week before Shabbat. I am Joe Hyman, JW3's young adult programmer. If you haven't seen, JW3 is closed physically, but we're open online, and it's very much still going on. JW3 is the UK's Jewish Community and Art Centre, and we are partnering to bring you this program with Limmud, a diverse and inclusive worldwide Jewish community. This series will ask educators, artists, and leaders from across the Jewish community in the UK and abroad to share a surprising piece of Jewish wisdom for our time. To ask your own questions on the text today, please comment on our live feed, and we will take some towards the end. I want to note that in response to the headlines of the past week and the events in the United States, JW3 will be hosting a panel with JCOR UK, spotlighting voices and experiences of Black people in the Jewish community in the UK and the USA. We will be joined by April Baskin, David Lammy MP, Nadine Batchelor-Hunt, Sir Simon Woolley, and Dr. Edie Friedman from JCOR. This event will happen on Sunday evening at 8 p.m. online. Please check out our website for more details, and please join us in solidarity with the Black community. Now, welcome Rabbi Leah Jordan, the Rabbi of Kehillah, North London, and a founding member of Na'amod. She served for a number of years as Progressive Jewish Chaplain for University students and young adults in the UK, and as the Congregational Rabbi of the Norwich Liberal Jewish Community. She spent 3 years in Jerusalem studying Torah and on the ground organizing. Leah hails from the deepest, darkest Midwestern America and lives in Kentish Town with her partner, Rabbi Benji Stanley. Welcome, Leah. How are you?
Thanks so much, Joe. I'm really happy to be here. It's been an intense week, I think, for many of us, and I'm glad to be learning some Torah with you.
Me too. So tell us, what's your unexpected text? What makes you go, it says what?
Well, when you emailed me about this, I thought to myself, in some ways, the reason I love Torah is because it surprises me. And at first I thought that means I need to bring something new and new to me. And then I realized that I actually wanted to go back to the first rabbinic literature text I think I ever learned when I was 16 years old, which is a bit of the Tosefta. So it's about 1800 years old. It in some ways might be the foundation of what we think of as mystical Judaism, the kind of esoteric, magical, mysterious side of Judaism. So for that reason, it's very bizarre and surprising. But it's also just the story of four guys, four Jewish scholars and their experience in the world. And I really love it. I'm excited to look at it with you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. For everyone that's watching, we've put the source sheet on screen share, and then Leah will teach it to us and we'll have a conversation about it afterwards. A reminder that if you have any questions throughout, please comment on our feed and we'll bring them into the conversation later on. I'm going to mute myself now.
Thanks, Joe. So as I said, this piece is from the Tosefta. The Tosefta is just a fancy word for the compilation that was built up at the same time as the Mishnah. So we're talking, as I said, about 1800 years ago in Eretz Yisrael, what was the land and still is the land of Israel geographically. And the Tosefta is, in some ways, the bits of the rabbinic tradition that, for whatever reason, didn't make it into Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi's Mishnah, the canonical central corpus around which the Talmud is then later written. And maybe to the point of it says what, it makes it in some ways sexier because it's the hidden bits, the mysterious bits, the bits that didn't make it in, which I think are often the more exciting ones. And I was taught this bit, as I said, as my first ever bit of Sifrut Chazal, of rabbinic literature, by my teacher, Dr. Yehuda Kurtzer, when I was 16 years old, so over half my lifetime ago. And it pricked my ears up then, and I returned to it obsessively. And especially at moments like the moment, the global moment we're in right now, when we're thinking about systems and change and confronting difficult things and whether we dismantle or whether we build, I think I don't want to be over determined about any Torah text, but I think it asks questions around that. So to place us in time, we're talking 1st or 2nd century of the Common Era in Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, in the north of Israel specifically, where the rabbinic community has formed after the destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans. And we're talking about 4 people who had a shared experience together that then afterward, because of this text and other texts in conversation with it, became famous. So some people even know this text by its Hebrew first few lines, Arba'a nichnasu lePardes, the 4 who entered the Pardes. And if you're asking what the heck is the Pardes, then you're with many of us. It's not translated here in the English because it can mean a lot of things. In its most simple sense, it means an orchard, literally a physical orchard of fruit trees. But it comes to stand in for Jewish mystical experience in general. So this text comes out of, as I said, the mystical tradition of Judaism, which means that it's in conversation with much earlier texts from the Tanakh, from the Hebrew Bible, and other bits, which are about what is the mysterious side of Jewish teaching? What are the bits that we don't talk about in polite company or in rational circles? And it seems to be that these 4 men who are listed here in this first line entered into some symbolic or real representation of this mystical experience. And the stand-in for that is the Pardes, the orchard, which sometimes people think of as an experience or encounter with God. You could think of it as a drug trip in modern sense, some kind of experience that was outside the norm. And they seem to have entered it through their studies or through their experience of the world itself, because these are 4 men who lived in very tumultuous times after the destruction of the Second Temple, and who also were deeply learned in Torah. And they, in some way, nichnasu lePardes, entered the Pardes. And who are our characters? They are, as we're told, Ben Azai, uben Zoma, Acher, v'Rabbi Akiva. Ben Azai, Ben Zoma, Acher, and Rabbi Akiva. Ben Azai and Ben Zoma, interestingly, at least in the Hebrew, though the English doesn't retain this, are paired as 2 figures. There's a vav between them, so they're Ben Azai and Ben Zoma. And then Acher and Rabbi Akiva are paired as Acher and Rabbi Akiva. So we're even already, if we're listening to the subtleties of the text, aware that there's our 2 pairs within these foursomes. And the first pair, I'm already going to tell you, if you come here with your contextualization of rabbi history, you would know that these are the lesser of the 2 pairings. Ben Azai and Ben Zoma are famous for being not famous, actually. They are forever considered the Talmidei Hachamim, the students of the rabbis, disciples of the wise, and are never referred to or never really seen as teachers like Rabbi Akiva in their own right. And in fact, we're both students of Rabbi Akiva, the last man in our list. And then we have Acher, which literally means other, O-T-H-E-R in Hebrew. So we already, our ears are pricked, as I said, by this, because we don't know what we're speaking of when we talk about him, because we don't know who he is. And Rabbi Akiva, the very famous teacher of Torah of his generation. And these 4 people enter this mystical experience, and we're told 1 cast a look and died, 1 cast a look and became demented, 1 cast a look and cut the shoots, 1 went up safely and came down safely. I think there's a lot to unpack there, and that's actually what the rest of the text does, is just zoom in on this second paragraph and respond to or drash on, interpret what is going on here. So we're told Ben Azai was the one who cast a look and died. It actually goes in the same list form as we're introduced to these characters, their experiences. Ben Azai cast a look and died, and it says of him, scripture, Torah, Jewish literature says, precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of God's faithful ones, a very pious line from Psalms. And if we're going to pause for a moment and talk about Ben Azai, as I said, was one of these disciples of the wise, a person famous for being a student, as opposed perhaps to a student and a teacher of Torah. And he followed after Rabbi Akiva's opinions in many things, and he was considered extremely pious. And already we're wondering, what the heck did he see that made him look, or that he did look and then caused him to die? He seems to have expired in this moment, this experience. And we're already wondering, what does that mean? Was the experience too much for him? Was it so wonderful? Was it so terrible that he died? What was his interaction with this Pardes, this orchard, this experience of the divine, or of the realities of the universe, or of its mysteries, that made him have such a serious reaction of death to it? And I think the verse that the Tosefta uses to describe him is very characteristic of Ben Azai, because it's a verse from Psalms about those who are faithful to God, God's Hasidim, his or her or their righteous, pious ones. And Ben Azai is certainly in that school. And so he looks at this moment and he dies. And then we have his fellow student, who he's paired with in the Tosefta, Ben Zoma. He looked and became demented. He was wounded in some ways, the Hebrew seems to imply. And of him, Torah says, a line from Proverbs, have you found honey? Eat only that which is enough for you, lest you fill yourself and throw it up. And the verse seems to be saying here, somehow it was so much for him, for Ben Zoma, that his body rejected it. He vomited up the experience. That seems to be the wound, the mental response of this sort of dementia that happened to him. And then we get into, I think, the really interesting last half of this Tosefta, which is that we have Elisha cut down the shoots. If you remember at the top, we were not told who this person was. This person was Acher, the other, and only now is he named, already halfway through the text, and we're told that his name was actually Elisha, and he was the one that cut the shoots. Of him, scripture says, let not your mouth lead you into sin, and do not say before the angel, the malach, the messenger, that it was an error, lest God be angered by your talk and destroy the work of your hands. And this is a line from Kohelet, Ecclesiastes. So there's a lot to say about this. Elisha is who is identified as Acher, the other here. He was Rabbi Elisha ben Abuya, who is considered in many ways the bogeyman of the rabbinic tradition. He is the one that later, partly perhaps because of this story here in this piece of Tosefta, becomes the villain or the anti-hero, depending on how your politics and your Jewishness go, of the Talmud. He only appears very rarely, and when he does, he is identified as Acher, the other, and the most famous story cycle on him in the Talmud actually uses this Tosefta as its starting off point. It quotes this bit of Tosefta, and then it says, who is Acher, this guy who cut down the shoots? And I don't think it's coincidental that Ecclesiastes, Kohelet, is the verse that's used to speak of him, because Ecclesiastes is from the wisdom literature, from the miscellany or the ketuvim, the writings, the latter bit of the Hebrew Bible. And those are the bits I think that were also most challenging to the rabbis. They include Ecclesiastes, which in some ways seems to be a meditation on meaning in the world. And they include the book of Job, which also is about questions of justice and whether they are fulfilled or not fulfilled in the world as it is. And Elisha ben Abuya, over and over in the rabbinic tradition, they use quotes from those books to speak about him. So you can already tell he's a Job-like figure, a figure who is perhaps one sees railing with his fist raised in the way that Job does in parts of that book, or is perceived to be railing in Job. Though I think actually it's a big question, as it is with Elisha, what it is that Elisha and Job are challenging here. And I think that gets to the heart of the question of cut down the shoots. So we're in the metaphor of orchard, of a garden or a place full of trees. And Elisha, we're told, goes in and cuts down the plantlings, the shoots, the small sprouts that are starting to grow in the garden. And I think there's something in that metaphor that's really very fundamental to this text, and one of the reasons I keep coming back to it. And also, I think I want to offer, again, not over-determinedly about this moment, a question more largely around if you have an encounter with a system or with a structure or with a moment of clarity around the way the world works, as it seems to be these four men in some ways have that experience, and how do you react to that moment? And Elisha seems to react by trying to cut the roots or to dismantle it, to tear it down. And I don't know whether that is a organized response by him or a response that comes of the moment at that moment, or whether it's a combination of that. It comes from anger and then comes out in strategy. But I think he's very intentionally opposed to our last person here, Rabbi Akiva. So let's see what Rabbi Akiva does, and then we'll have the whole text in our head. So Rabbi Akiva departs unhurt. And of him, scripture says, draw me up after you, let us run. The king has brought me to his chambers, from the Song of Songs. And that is from Shir Shirim, the Song of Songs, which is Rabbi Akiva, famously one of his favorite texts. And the rabbis understand it as being about a love song between the Jewish people and the divine. It is in essence a very erotic love poem, an epic love poem. And Rabbi Akiva is very linked to it in the rabbinic tradition. And here he is associated with it very strongly in a sense of, I think, of peace, that in some ways he is able to enter this moment and come out of it. Literally, the Hebrew says he went up in peace and he came down in peace. And there's a sense that in some ways this experience, he was able to integrate it into his life. Or I remember actually my teacher, who I already mentioned, Yehuda Kurtzer, teaching this to us, and his comment was, which has always stuck with me, is it possible that this is a critique of Rabbi Akiva, the great hero of his generation here, in that an experience where three of his other friends and colleagues either died, were wounded mentally by this moment, or had such a strong reaction that they went around and felt that they needed to dismantle some aspect of this experience, that he rose up in peace into it and left in peace. Even if we're just talking on the basic level of colleague, he saw his three friends and his students and his colleagues have such intense experiences, and yet he was able somehow to depart from this unhurt. And it might be an indictment here, Rabbi Akiva, that he wasn't alive, perhaps, what was going on for either his colleagues and their own experience of this moment, or that the thing itself, whatever they experienced, did not affect him or challenge him in the same way, which is very interesting because at the same time, Rabbi Akiva was the great hero of the Bar Kokhba revolt, the revolt against Rome, which also happened in the lifetime of these men, where the Jewish community in Palestine, in Roman occupied Palestine, as the colony of Rome was called then, he revolted against the Romans and was killed. And so in some ways, people see this orchard moment as perhaps a analogy for that whole rebellion. And if so, they see it as a moment where Rabbi Akiva entered that rebellion with full integrity and left as a martyr. So that's a way you can read it heroically for Rabbi Akiva. But in any case, I want to zoom in on Acher as we open this up to questions, because the reason I keep coming back to this text is because I think this is perhaps a text about confronting difficult things or confronting challenging esoteric or things around justice that are hard to grasp, whether that's rebellion, as it was in Rabbi Akiva's case, or whether that's something to do with Elisha's challenging of the whole rabbinic tradition, which he later goes on to be the emblem of, and having to fundamentally dismantle something in order to respond to it with integrity. And that's why it's sitting with me this week. I would love to hear people's questions, and Joe, your responses to this text. I'm so glad to get to learn it together.
Thank you so much, Leah. It's a really wonderful, wonderful text that contains so much. And it, when I first read it, when you sent it over, yes, for everyone out there, I get to look at the text first, so I'm at a head start, but we're still expecting questions from you. So when I looked at this text first, it's confusing. Why are they going into the orchard to begin with,
Yes.
or the
Yes.
Pardes to begin with? Who has made them go in? And I like the idea that it's an analogy of the Bar Kokhba rebellion. That makes sense to me. But is there any context that this story sits in that tells us more about why they went in the first place?
I'm not sure exactly to that question, but to questions of context in general about what the Pardes might be if it's not rebellion, I think I can speak to that, and it might also answer that question. So in Elisha ben Abuya's story cycle that I mentioned briefly around this, when the Talmud asks who he is, who Acher is in the story, and then he's identified as Elisha ben Abuya, the Talmud goes on to say, for him, it seems to be that this experience was experiencing injustice in the world. So the reasons were given, at least in the most famous story of Elisha ben Abuya in the Talmud, for why he cut the shoots, as it were, in this moment, was that perhaps he saw, the Talmud says, the tongue of Judah the baker, a famous teacher of Torah, in the mouth of a dog running down the street, and the tongue was dripping blood out of the dog's mouth. And this is a moment of Jewish trauma memory about the revolt against Rome, and the sense that the revolt was done in all great integrity and righteousness, and the response was so brutal and so violent, and also the recompense for that by what were considered great heroes like Rabbi Akiva was death, was violent death. And so it seems to be that when Elisha ben Abuya experienced these moments where he saw that the world didn't respond with justice to their great claim for justice, and another moment that is given parallel to that is that, no, maybe it wasn't that he saw anything so outside of many of our experiences as that. Maybe it was he saw some very, very simple moment of injustice where he saw a man go up a tree to get the eggs out of a nest, and that man fulfilled the fundamental mitzvah or commandment in the Torah for which you're told you get long life, which is that he shooed the mother bird away and he took the eggs. And that's one of the only mitzvot in the Torah that we're told if you do it, you will get long life. And the man came down after having fulfilled that mitzvah and was bitten by a snake and died on the spot. And it was either this moment of rebellion and serious injustice of that tongue dripping in the mouth of the dog, or it was this very normal moment where you see a person you love who dies in their prime before you think it would be just for them to do so, doing something good, and yet they die anyway. And he couldn't reconcile this sense of injustice in the world. And for him, that was the Pardes, which I think is really interesting. And so in that sense, I think the Pardes was not something they were made to enter. It was just their experience of life and of Torah, that they were experiencing the world, and they were experiencing it through the lens of the Torah and the rabbi's promise that justice is done for us in God's sight. And he wasn't seeing that. And that's why he's so dangerous, I think, as a challenge to the rabbis, because they feel those concerns themselves, I think.
And with the other rabbis that died or became ill, does this speak of something in kind of in a response to the injustice that they saw in a similar way, or do you feel that also relates to that, or does it relate to something different to you? And just to throw another thing in, just to add to the load, do you feel that this story favors one of the approaches, or do you feel that this story is presenting these approaches and saying, go figure?
I think I'm actually going to move because I think I'm in the sun and I'm overheating my laptop, which is a fundamental fail in this moment of Zoom. So I'm just going to move over.
It's fine. It's all good.
Exactly. I think it's a really good question. Every time I come back to this text, I realize how multivocal it is, because the way, as I said, it was first taught to me by Yehuda Kurtzer, he says, what's going on here that Rabbi Akiva seems to be so placid, and that seems like an indictment. But I think there's another way to read this where he is the hero of the piece, as I said. And there's another way to read this where Elisha's story is the one that sticks in the mind and becomes the most challenging. I think Ben Azai and Ben Zoma and I would be very happy to be challenged on this by others who know better, are the backdrop I think them as the pairing that's put first, and the ones who are considered the students of teachers, in some ways they are establishing for us the picture, which is that this is a really serious encounter. And then the way that Rabbi Akiva and Elisha diverge in that moment is the multivocality that you have to deal with, because it can't both be okay that one entered in peace and left in peace, and that one cut the shoots. Those are such fundamentally opposite opinions that they're almost in a dialectic with each other. And I think depending on how you come to the text, you end up with a different feeling about who's the hero.
Yeah,
I think.
100%. That makes it really clear to me. Yeah, that way you come into it feels really vital here. I want to just ask a couple of questions from the audience, and then come back to a question about Benzoma that struck me. But just one clarifying question. Who wrote the Tosefta? From Imola Leah Nemes.
It's a great question, and it's a question that scholars ask all the time. So the tradition is that the Mishnah, which is in some ways its parallel text, was compiled by Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, the great rabbinic leader of his generation, out of many, many sources over a few hundred years. And you'll see all of those various rabbis are quoted in the Mishnah, and the Tosefta is set up very similarly. And I was told by a great teacher of mine years ago that the Mishnah and the Tosefta were set up contrapuntally, which is just a very fancy word for a game of tennis, meaning the Mishnah would kind of do something or codify something, and then the Tosefta would codify it in response, and then the Mishnah would codify a bit and the Tosefta, and that they kind of came up together, and that in the end, the Mishnah, it seems, was more condensed and more edited, and the Tosefta was allowed more wild, free reign. And so it's a bigger piece of literature, and it's more unwieldy, and it seems to be more multivocal, which is why I think they think that Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, that there was a senior editor with a capital E of the Mishnah. The Tosefta, we don't know. I have not heard if there is considered one head, but it would have been presumably many of the rabbis of the school of that time, around 250 of the Common Era, if that helps the questioner imagine the answer. Yeah.
Thank you. So one more question from the audience, and I'll throw out my question just because of time, and you can answer them in any order you'd like. One of our keen textual analysis audience members, who's noticed that Rabbi Akiva in the Hebrew lacks the word chitzitz, to look, and what the significance of that is. All of the others looked and were deeply affected, and Rabbi Akiva didn't look. And my question to you is about Ben Azai and this idea of that he ate too much for him, and it was too much, and like that idea of I don't know, taking on too much or overwhelming oneself with knowledge. It feels confusing right now for me to hear that, especially in the context of our world right now, because knowledge is important and powerful. So throwing those two at you together.
I'm really glad. So the Rabbi Akiva bit, I think, reveals again how well thought out this piece is. Because in one hand, you could say that the fact that his verbiage is different than the other three shows his exceptionalness, right? That it says, ascended in peace and descended in peace, rather than looked, as your questioner so rightly points out. Could be that he knew that this moment was one of ascent, of spiritual ascent, and he met the moment correctly. And the other three, the reason they came to death and to harm, or to harm other things, was because they didn't interact in that way. And then the other, I think, answer staring us in the face is he wasn't willing to look, and he wasn't able to look it and confront it in the face. And if looking in the face is looking in the face of injustice, as the Talmud then goes on to say, Acher Elisha ben Abuya is doing, then actually it's again an indictment of him, that he wasn't able to meet the moral demand of the moment in his discomfort, with questions, with an ability to be open to what was happening. So it's interesting to see that I really think can be interpreted either way. And then your question, I'm actually going to get my printout of the text right here, about that you're saying, why is it that Benzoma, he, it seems, took in too much and vomited. I think that's really interesting. I don't have an answer that comes to mind to that challenge, in the sense that I like that challenge and I want it to remain. Is it that the Tosefta seems to say, if you take in too much information, you're going to vomit it up? Is that he took it in the wrong way? Because I think you're right. I agree that information in itself should be something we could take in. The thing that's occurring to me right now is I'm very aware that the way that I take in information right now, I have to be very careful about. If I'm on social media for too long and too toxic of an environment, even if I think I'm informing myself, I might actually just be harming myself. And that's resonating with me with Benzoma, in the sense that the word used for that he became demented is a passive word, meaning it redounded on him and he was self-wounded in some way. And I do think we do self-wound sometimes when we don't frame the way we're taking in information. And so maybe I could offer up that as a possible answer to the question.
Great, thank you so much. One thought that I will share, kind of, that I leave with question marks, which is part of this, and it's important, which is, Rabbi Akiva rose, and is that because of a sense of obligation, or he has a higher standing, a higher kind of approach to this, or is it because he could and the others couldn't? He had some sense of privilege, and the idea that the other two just gazed is powerful to me. Elisha ben Avuya, he acted, but this idea of gazing is something that I think, and I don't want to blame these rabbis for their various responses, because clearly it's human to look at something and react, whether it would be with as harsh as death, or as illness, or whatever it is, or with a response like Rev. Elisha. But the idea of just gazing, and then gazing for too long, and that definitely relates to your thought about Benzoma and kind of consuming information at the moment. That gazing for too long without acting or doing something feels dangerous to me.
I love that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to say thank you so much, Rabbi Leah Jordan. It's been wonderful to learn with you in this moment, and I look forward to learning more together. I wanted to remind everyone about our event on Sunday evening at 8 p.m. in response to the events happening in the United States following the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery, and many others. We'll be coming together to hear Black people in the Jewish community and outside the Jewish community in the UK and USA speak about this and what we can do as a community in the UK. Once again, thank you, Leah, and Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you. Shabbat Shalom.